Debbie MacCoy's condo complex has crumbling foundations. She's been pushing for testing for years and says this is a necessity.
Hello, my name's Debbie MacCoy and I'm the Connecticut Concrete Queen, and this is part 3 of a 3-part series on Ireland. Ireland's housing crisis due to reactive iron sulfide minerals, pyrite and pyrrhotite. 1 year after Ireland allowed self-regulation in 2001, the European Union's Technical Committee, 2002, published 2 very important harmonized aggregate standards to be implemented by each member state, EN 13242 and EN 12620. However, most labs use the acid digestion test method that is called for in both aggregate European standards. EN 13242, aggregate for hardcore, unbound materials used in civil engineering and road construction. NSAI published Guidance SR 21 in 2004 for use with aggregates in the harmonized standard. The testing method used was EN 1744-1, total sulfur assessment. EN 12620, aggregate for use in concrete, NSAI published Guidance SR 16 for use with aggregates in the harmonized standard. The testing method again used is EN 1744-1, 1998, total sulfur, and in clause 6.3.2 in EN 12620 states if pyrrhotite is present, the limit is 0.1% as it's an unstable iron sulfide mineral. Both harmonized European norms are standards for aggregate that were implemented in Ireland, and Irish standard recommendations were created for both in 2004. However, as evidenced by the crisis in Ireland, the aggregate standards were not adhered to by the extraction industry and not enforced by the Ireland government. Moreover, when those in power of market surveillance were questioned over the past 2 decades, the answer was that it was the manufacturer's responsibility to ensure their products were fit for purpose. The housing consumers were not assured that enforcement of the European quarry standards would be followed. In late February 2019, the late James Lombard of Ground Investigation Ireland stated in an interview, "Testing is not enormously expensive and can avert a disaster. In one instance, all the tests were perfect, and then all of a sudden, boom, they failed." As mentioned, the majority of labs use the acid digestion method, which has been shown to underestimate total sulfur, pyrite pyrrhotite by 23% to 85% and does not identify what species of pyrite or pyrrhotite, and that is extremely important if dealing with pyrrhotite and framboidal pyrite. As mentioned in part 2, the building boom in Ireland, 1998 through 2008, had its consequences in that corners were cut by the construction industry, quarry industry. These consequences manifest itself only a few years after construction in the Dublin area, with the hardcore fill being substandard, causing thousands of homes to deal with pyrite heave because the fill had an abundance of framboidal pyrite as well. Along the west coast of Ireland, with concrete block houses expansively and continuously cracking and crumbling, with aggregate being the original sin that has caused so much destruction to homes in Ireland, with the majority of counties being affected and a cost to the government of billions of euros, you would think they would move quickly to solve the crisis and stop the fires from burning. But the fires still burn, and houses are left a shell of what they were the day they were first built. But here lies the conundrum. The folks affected by substandard aggregate in the fill under the floor slabs have a remediation scheme, whereas the folks affected by substandard aggregate used in concrete blocks have a grant scheme. I set out to prove the inequalities of the two aggregate schemes from my 9 years of research and interviews I conducted with experts that had boots on the ground during the pyrite heave crisis and experts that had boots on the ground during the defective concrete block crisis. And I made 2 trips to Ireland to see firsthand the devastation left behind from the extractive industry not doing its due diligence in testing the source prior to using the stone for aggregate and construction products. With the pyrite heave crisis, as Dr. Brian Hawkins pointed out, extensive testing took place after structures started cracking only 2 years after being built, 2003 to 2005. And the engineers looked to mechanical reasons for cracking, blaming it on settling cracks or improper workmanship. However, it was neither. And after chasing the cracks, engineers began to turn to experts in the field of geology. It was Dr. Michael Mayer, who returned to his homeland of Ireland in 2005, that was contacted by folks dealing with the cracks that continued to return after patching them up. Dr. Michael Mayer advised folks to reach out to his colleague in Canada, Fred Schremer, from Goldair Associates. In late 2006, Mr. Schremer was contacted. In 2007, he advised folks through the petrographic analysis conducted on the samples given to him that it was pyrite heave due to the use of mudstone with framboidal pyrite. The extensive testing Dr. Hawkins alludes to explained in great detail the cause for floor slabs cracking. I will explain in my next show the experts who came to Ireland the first wave and the second wave and the reviewers of both. Another point that Dr. Hawkins points out and cannot be stressed enough in the Ireland crisis, the possible presence of pyrrhotite, and not just pyrite, should always be considered, and the implications of this taken seriously. The speed with which the reactions will take place cannot be assessed on chemistry alone, as it's important to appreciate the presence of framboidal pyrite and pyrrhotite, which react much more quickly than lumps of iron sulfides. For this reason, for the process to be fully understood, the skills of an experienced petrographer are required. Hawkins refers to 3 forms of pyrite. 1, the clumps, lumps, least reactive form. 2, framboidal clusters of seeds, much more reactive. And 3, pyrrhotite, unstable and the most reactive form. Also, one should regard what Frederick Gagnon stated in 2016. An investigation is necessary for the identification of the exact cause, not a suggested cause, in order to identify the proper course of action. While the pyrite remediation scheme has developed the proper course of action based on the extensive testing by experts in the field, the DCB grant scheme has acknowledged framboidal pyrite in every other county affected by DCB, defective concrete blocks, with the exception of the hardest hit county, with thousands of houses affected, holding out the proper course of action due to a suggested cause and not a scientifically proven cause. In October 2021, Professor Paul Dunlop reached out to me for help 4 years ago this month, followed up by one of the advocates in County Donegal, Eileen Doherty, in December 2021. Professor Dunlop joined an October 2021 CROG Zoom meeting. That's the Capital Regional Council of Government here in Connecticut, which has its guest speakers, both University of Connecticut and Trinity College, Hartford, Connecticut, who delivered results from their research on pyrrhotite. I remember Professor Dunlop during the Q&A portion of the Zoom meeting explained to those of us in the meeting the crisis Ireland was facing and that lab results from petrolabs were coming back with appreciable amounts of pyrrhotite over the EU limits. It was at that time Yukon offered to help Ireland. In December 2021, Eileen Doherty was in Brussels speaking in front of the EU Commission regarding the plight of the homeowners and sent me a private message asking me to round up my geologist friends to see if anyone would be willing to help Ireland understand pyrrhotite and participate in research with Professor Dunlop. Also, in August 2021, Eileen had sent me an email requesting my help understanding pyrrhotite. Included in the email were folks in the 2021 working group, as well as John O'Connor, the homeowner liaison. And I'll get into John O'Connor in the next episode, because as I said in the previous episode, he wears a lot of hats and he's probably the most worked gentleman in the government. And Damon Owens, Engineer Ireland, chartered engineer. So all the people that were in that email, I sent them a very lengthy email explaining pyrrhotite. The January Zoom meeting, I had invited 10 geologists from the USA and Canada, and Professor Dunlop invited world-leading expert Dr. Andres Lehman. And someone invited Damon MacCoy, the chartered engineer, and the engineer in late 2013 who told a large crowd of affected homeowners he believed the pattern cracking was due to mica. Unfortunately, the suggested mica cause led to a 12-year misdiagnosis confirmed through a desktop study with no testing commissioned by the Minister for Housing. Ask yourself, why no testing commissioned? Under an investigation is the million-dollar question. If they had tested the suspected quarry like we had, if they had tested the concrete blocks, the aggregate on the market, they would have stopped the fires burning long ago. Extensive testing of the aggregate for hardcore fill versus no testing of the aggregate for concrete uses began the inequality legacy that has confounded experts around the world watching how Ireland is handling a humanitarian crisis and largest consumer protection failure of our time. Houses that look like they have been in a war zone. Crumbling concrete blocks lay waste on the ground. Mold growing up the walls. Cracks you could put your hands through. Chimneys near collapse and water pouring into the houses with storms wailing against the weak structures. Last episode, part 2 on Ireland, I shared with the audience a few stark differences between the two aggregate schemes. However, since that episode, I have completed my research on the two schemes, reviewing 10 years of reports from the Pyrite Resolution Board that oversees the remediation scheme and works with the housing agency, the Pyrite Panel Report of 2012, the Expert Panel Report of 2017, the Working Group Minute Meetings of 2021, and the Expert Group of 2022, as well as the Attorney General's letter to Minister Dara O'Brien in September 2021. I could have a whole show based on that 6-page letter that the Attorney General sent in September 2021 when the working group was meeting from June through the end of September. And the Attorney General's letter was so punitively written about these victims. Like I said, I could spend an entire episode just talking about that. So I've read the Minister Dara O'Brien, September 21, and Engineer Ireland's submission to the working group in September 21, as well as the aggregate schemes. From my research, I have shown the stark differences and inequality that was afforded one victim of aggregate versus another victim of aggregate. The cause of the differences, the cost to make the victims whole. I ask the audience to imagine you are a victim of substandard aggregate. Your home is damaged due to the aggregate used to construct the house. It affects your daily living, your mental health, your safety. The nightmare is the same. The fears and worries are the same. The financial stressors are the same. The failure of the market are the same. Improper sourcing are the same. Insurance denials are the same. So why aren't the aggregate schemes the same? From timely and appropriate action taken, that's what the Pyrite panel stated in their report, that the actions that were taken up to them making their report were fast and quick, and they believed they were appropriate. To years of delay and barriers for the defective concrete blocks victims. The first aggregate scheme is pro-homeowners, saving its market value. The second aggregate scheme is pro-government, saving its exchequer money. The Pyrite panel 2011 to 2012 had 24 recommendations. The expert panel 2016 to 2017 had 8 recommendations. There was a pyrite remediation scheme versus a defective concrete block grant scheme. Brendan Toohey was the chairperson, Noel Carroll, the former senior advisor at the Department of Housing, and Malcolm Edgar, charter civil engineer, former director of P.H. McCarthy Consulting Engineers. On the DCB grant scheme, Dennis McCarthy, chairperson, civil engineer, Waterford County Council. Noel Kane, NSAI member nominated by NSAI, and Frank Lee, member of Engineer Ireland, and he happened to be the chairperson of the Technical Committee 63 for Irish Standard 465, 2018. That's the standard that the homeowners have had to live by for the past 7 years, which incorrectly stated the cause was mica. Therefore, the appropriate actions that were taken weren't appropriate. So the similarities between the two is the pyrite heave scheme and the defective concrete block scheme. Similar. Aggregate is the cause for both. Both have a harmonized European norm, 13242, 12620, both created in 2002. Both no fault of their own, both scheme of last resort. The government set up a pyrite panel, the government set up an expert panel. The government set up a registrar, the government set up a registrar of engineers that were technically taught how to implement the IS 398 and the IS 465. The Irish Standard Protocol, as I just mentioned, IS 398, 1 and 2 for 2013, and Irish 465. And they were both regarding testing, assessing, and categorizing the homes. And they both prioritized the work. In the pyrite heave, it was a damage condition report, and it had to be a number 2 for them to be able to get onto the scheme. If it was damage condition number 1, it meant that there was, testing showed that there was pyrite in the aggregate. However, there were no consequences of it at that point because there were no damages. So they only repaired homes that were significantly damaged. Homes that just had slight cracking, they monitored them until they moved up to DCR2. Similar to what we have here in Connecticut, where we have a severity class coding, severity class 3, severity class 2, and severity class 1. Severity class 1 is just homes that have tested positive to trace amounts of pyrrhotite, no damages whatsoever. They will never be repaired. Severity class 2 will eventually be repaired once it reaches the damage threshold of severity class 3. And many of the severity class 2s have been repaired to date here in Connecticut because over time, they do rise to the occasion of severity class 3. And over in the defective concrete block, they prioritize the work by a damage threshold as well. Because in all three cases, Connecticut, Ireland's pyrite heave, and Ireland's defective concrete block, they want to take care of the worst first. So that's why there's a damage threshold. So now what are the differences? Now, when I first brought this up in the last episode, I only had a few. But since then, I have 2 pages worth of differences. And that is astounding because there shouldn't be differences, but there are. The pyrite remediation scheme was geologist-led. Chemical breakdown. The defective concrete block was engineer-led. Mechanical breakdown. The pyrite remediation scheme was handled with expedience, whereas the defective concrete block grant scheme was handled with delays. 24 recommendations in 8 stages from the pyrite panel were recommended, and 8 recommendations with 3 stages were recommended from the expert panel. 44 interviews with individuals and organizations versus 21 interviews with individuals and organizations. Testing was done for the pyrite heave. No testing was commissioned for the defective concrete blocks. So when the minister asked the pyrite panel to look into this, he said, you're not to apportion blame on anyone. And we just want to find out the nature of the problem and how many houses are affected. The problem with that is no testing was allowed. Now, how can you have an investigation into the cause if you're not going to test? And then the expert panel went on to say that in County Donegal, it was suggested, that is their words. Every time they addressed the victims, they called them these people, setting them aside from the way the pyrite panel spoke of the victims. So in the pyrite panel remediation scheme, there was a thing called exceptional circumstances. That was when a house, there's 2 houses adjoining, and the first house has a DCR2, which means you move forward on the scheme and your home gets fixed. But the attached house has a DCR1. Under that, they have an exceptional circumstance where they will repair both at the same time. Value for money. Remember that. Value for money. That's important. Now, on the DCB scheme, no exceptional circumstances. They are doing houses all over Ireland. I seen it for myself this last visit 1 month ago. They have a house that's adjoined to another house, and they have literally torn this house to pieces to remove and replace all the defective concrete blocks, leaving the house that has the same material, the pyrrhotite, but they're leaving it there because it hasn't reached that damage threshold. Makes no sense. It would save money to do both at the same time. Tax exemptions for pyrite homes. When the scheme, now there's been one and only scheme for the pyrite heave, but there's been 2 schemes for the defective concrete blocks. The first was the 90-10 scheme, the second, and that was created in 2019, and the regulations were produced in 2020. So since 2020, all the way until 2023, when the regulations were produced, prior to that, there were no allowances for storage, no allowances for livable, when you have to have the home repaired, you have to move to different accommodations. So in the 90-10 scheme, there were no allowances for storage or renting another home. But on the Pyrite scheme, there were allowances for it. And they actually 3 times amended that for the Pyrite Heave folks by upping the amount in the allowances. It started at $1,000 per month, and then it was $1,500, and then it went to $2,000 per month. Whereas on the defective concrete block, they had no allowances whatsoever. Who cares, right? So they had the exceptional circumstance, no exceptional circumstance. They had a clause for financial hardship for paid costs under the Pyrite scheme. So the only costs for the folks in the Pyrite scheme, because it was 100% end to end, the homeowner handed over their keys and got their home back 12 weeks later with everything done, and they had to pay nothing except for storage fees and for accommodation fees. And they did not get their money for those 2 items until they received the certificate of occupancy, that it was complete. However, if they showed a financial hardship and they needed that money up front, they got it. There were no financial hardship clauses for the defective concrete block homeowners. Tax exemption for the Pyrite homes versus no tax exemption for the DCB homes. However, now they are allowed tax exemptions. Testing, investigation, collaboration, no testing, as I mentioned, to be commissioned. No upfront costs to pay contractors on the Pyrite Heave remediation scheme. And there were no testing, there were no upfront costs for anything in the Pyrite Heave. However, there were upfront costs to pay contractors under the DCB scheme. The remediation was at the highest standard versus minimum feasible option. That's what they had. That's what they told the victims. We're going to do the minimum feasible option, and they were hoping they would choose option 4, pardon me. There's 5 options, okay, to the DCB grant scheme. And 4 of them are Band-Aids, and 1 is remove and replace. Here in Connecticut, our foundations are removed and replaced. In the Pyrite Heave, the fill is removed and replaced. However, in Donegal, the hardest hit county, no. Remember, it was engineer-led. They gave you a mechanical failure cause. They said, no, 90% of these homes can be fixed and repaired by option 5, which is only removing the outer layer of the concrete blocks. So they left all the rest of that and never once took into consideration the chemical failure, the chemical breakdown, that internal sulfide attack that is just going to keep going forever until it's removed and replaced. There's actually a building that Dr. Brian Hawkins speaks of, a structure, I believe it was a hospital, that after 50 years, it was still oxidizing. It was still deteriorating. So, yeah. Ground floor of the house is handed to homeowner in show house condition. Over in the DCB grant, reinstate family homes to a livable sound condition. There were no financial barriers, as I just mentioned, end to end. However, there were financial barriers, upfront costs, allowance and accommodation storage, and in the 90-10 scheme, as I just mentioned, no allowance for accommodation and storages. There are now. They had to fight for that. Allowances for BCA report up to €500. The financial barriers in the beginning on the 90-10 scheme was that the homeowners had to pay for the testing and the engineer costs at a cost of $6,000 to $7,000. So that was their first financial barrier, proving what they had by having an engineer come out, doing the sampling and the testing and waiting for the reports to come back and waiting for the engineer to write up the report. And so that was a huge financial barrier. Homebound, the insurance, had agreement with their first agreement. They had two agreements with the Pyrite remediation scheme. The first was that they would pay for the costs of project managers and testing. There was no homebound agreement for the DCB grant scheme, no project manager and testing to be commissioned by Homebound. Homebound's second agreement was they would repair any structural damages during the works. So anytime the engineers and the contractors opened up the home to remove the fill and they saw other issues with the home, Homebound paid for that. No Homebound, no second agreement. They left the hazardous materials behind. No sunset date for the remediation scheme. However, under the grant scheme, the delay scheme is what most people call it, there is a 15-year sunset date. So in 2020, when it finally, hit the pavement, they said there's a 15-year sunset. However, we are going to delay this for as long as we possibly can. So now here it is, 2025. They got 220 homes done. Yay. And out of that 220, there's only a fraction of rebuilt homes. The rest are all those options I told you about. Option 5, outer leaf. Option 4, outer leaf with an extra Band-Aid, that kind of thing. So the sunset date is still ticking, and they've only got 220, and they've got 6,000 to 7,000 homes they need to repair. Whereas in the 10 years under the Pyrite remediation scheme, they have 3,000 of the 3,400 homes that have applied. They've got 3,000 homes done. No time limit for start and end of the repairs. However, there is a time limit for the completion of the works under the DCP grant. Procedures for cost overruns, no cost to the affected homeowner. Remember I mentioned in the beginning, the Pyrite panel stated it'd be about $45,000 to remediate, to remove and replace. It's now €95,000. And no homeowner has had to see or pay or wait for an amendment to cost for inflation. No, it's built in. They just pay for it. Cost overruns limited by caps. Affected homeowners must pay. Still continuing on with the differences. Pyrite remediation scheme. In 5 years, I'm using 5 years because we've only had 5 years of remediation in the DCB remediated homes. In 5 years, the first 5 years of the Pyrite remediation scheme, 73% of the homes were remediated. In 5 years under the DCB grant, 7% of the homes. The appeals process set up first year for the Pyrite heave, immediately set up and has been going on. And I think in all 10 years, there's been maybe 180 appeals, maybe less, but they were addressed right away. And the appeals process under the DCB grant scheme has been delayed. Homeowners still haven't heard anything about their appeals, and they've been waiting for over a year, year and a half. No caps, all costs paid by scheme. Caps in the 90-10 and in the enhanced. Pyrite Resolution Board made recommendations, as I just mentioned, extends the scope. They've extended it 3 times to other counties and authorities. And it was the board that made these recommendations. It's the board that advocates for the affected homeowners. It's the board that suggested the allowances be raised for accommodations. There's no board under the 90-10 scheme or the enhanced scheme. Now they have the housing agency taking over, and there's no one really keeping the housing agency in check. There's no transparency. On the pyrite remediation scheme, every year they produce an annual report, and every quarter they produce a report. You know how many applicants for that year, how many applicants total, how many repairs were done in that year, how many repairs in total, how much they spent on the board, how much they spent on setting everything up. I mean, you know bit by bit the costs. Under the DCB grant scheme, there's been no transparency. They just said, oh, we've spent $196 million so far. Really? On what? Not with 220 homes repaired. It just blows the mind. DOH minister immediately met with banks and insurance and construction industry. He met with them 1 month after August 31st, 2011, when Homebound said they would no longer insure the homes. We're still waiting for the DOH minister himself, not sending off his civil servants that work in DOH. No, the minister sitting down, asking for solutions, rolling his sleeves up, never once yet. It's run by a central entity advocating for the homeowners in the Pyrite scheme. There's no central entity. It's run by the council, run by the housing agency, run by the janitor. You know, there's no central entity at all. Public awareness, September 2011, under the Pyrite remediation scheme. And they had the scheme up and running in 2.4 years. 2.4 years. Let that sink in. Under the DCB grant, public awareness, October 2013. The DCB grant scheme 2020, it took 7 years. What was going on in 2013? Let's just take that year for 1 second. 2013, they had already, from 2011 to 2012, set up the Pyrite panel. They gave a report, and by the end of 2012, they stated, we're going to set up an informal Pyrite resolution board to set up the scheme. It took them 1 year, and this was well thought out. And by 2014, the scheme was hit the pavement running, and they were accepting applications. For the DCB 2013, they became aware. So what's going on here? Well, they wanted to get all those homes taken care of. They wanted to get that DCB thing running, up and running. But in 2013, it took 2014 to meet with ministers and professionals, 2015 to meet with them, till they finally established an expert panel that met in April 2016 until June 2017 to give a report on a desktop study based on 50 homes, 64 reports, no testing commissioned. So no walking to the suspected quarry, none of it, okay? So you ask yourself, why was it done in 2.4 years at record speed for government? And it took 7 years over at the DCB grant scheme. And for Connecticut, we learned in July 2015, our investigation went for an entire year, and investigation, by that I mean we hired the University of Connecticut to go to the suspected quarry to remove aggregate, test it, and learn the actual cause, which was pyrrhotite. In the DCB, that 1 year, all they did was this: shoveled paperwork, looked at some reports, and in their report, they actually stated it was suggested mica was the cause. Hold on here. There are now, they're saying 20 counties are affected, all of them from pyrite, and only one county that has the bulk of all the houses is affected by mica. Mica doesn't cause hardened concrete to continuously, expansively crack. What does is the internal sulfide attack. And what causes the internal sulfide attack? Reactive pyrite pyrrhotite that is oxidized, that creates second mineral formation, and that second mineral formation creates the endogite and the thaumasite. The endogite causing the expansive cracking, and the thaumasite causing weakened concrete. So getting back to this. Value for money. Framework panel, they tendered engineers and contractors under the pyrite remediation scheme. There's no value for money. The engineers consult for the state. So on the pyrite remediation scheme, they had a framework panel of contractors and engineers that they hired. The costs were always evaluated. It's the wild, wild west when we're talking about the DCB scheme. The contractors are setting the prices, the engineers are. There's a cap. There's now a $420,000 cap. Where's the value for money? Like I said, 2 houses can be adjoining, and they're just taking down one house. Engineers are going along with that. That's gross, okay? And then leaving the other house, and then they'll have to circle back and do that and disrupt both households all over again. Ugh. It's a sour taste in my mouth because it's stupid, and I don't like stupid. So there's an annual customer satisfaction survey that's done every year for the pyrite remediation scheme. There's no customer satisfaction survey. The majority of the victims, the affected homeowners, can't avail the scheme because of the barriers they have set up. Now, they will, under the enhanced scheme, allow for storage and allow for accommodations, and now they allow for paying for the engineering tests and costs, okay? So those 3 things, yay. But we still have the hugest financial barrier, and that is the victims have to come up with the upfront costs to pay for $420,000 worth of repairs. Really? How many people? And most of these homeowners for the defective concrete, remember, I said to you, 1998 to 2008, most of these homes were built. I did a survey of 100 homeowners, and the bulk of the homes were built in 2003 to 2008, and the number 1 year was 2006. Well, I did some investigative work on that and found out that in 2006, 96,000 homes were built. 2006, many of those homes were built from the aggregate with the hardcore fill, the pyrite, that affected a lot of homes, thousands. I mean, we're talking over 35,000 homes that have already applied for the pyrite heave, and thousands of homes that have applied for the defective concrete block. And in the year where most homes were affected was the year they built 93,000 homes. Uh-oh. it's too bad the government didn't enforce those European standards for quarries on aggregate for hardcore fill and aggregate for concrete. So the annual customer satisfaction, nope. Majority can't avail the scheme. Damon English in 2018 was reported to be saying in an article, and I'll bring that up in the next episode, 1,000 repairs have been done. So when they started repairing the homes in 2015, it was only a pilot project, 5 units. So they really didn't start fixing the homes until 2016. By the end of 2017, they were 5 houses shy of 1,000. March 2018, Damon English, the Minister for Housing, reported 1,000 homes had been repaired. And he stated, "It shows we are delivering for the participants on the scheme." In 2018, he was overseeing things for the DCB homeowners. Remember, he was the one that received that report from the expert panel in June of 2017. He was okay with them not commissioning, not testing. He was okay with the IS 465 2018 that was mostly engineers on that panel, on that technical committee that said it was mica. So anyways, the SCSI in 2022, terms of reference construction costs within the parameter of the scheme using pre-2008 regulations. So I told you about the Attorney General letter. He mentioned make sure you make it perfectly clear that the DCB grant is going to be based on regulations pre-2008. After 2008, they changed the regulations for the building code regulations. And since then, they are making the families build to the year that they built the homes. So any changes for that they've found over the years that were a problem issue, they're not getting them. So the PRB, the Pyrite Resolution Board in 2019, after they had already done 1,000 homes, after each year of high satisfaction from their clients, they had an audit done. In August of 2019, consultancy firm Mazars undertook an independent value for money review of the pyrite remediation scheme, leading to the conclusion that the PRB, in close collaboration with the housing agency, delivers very good results in terms of issues of value for money. The scheme addresses consumers' detriment by dwellings recovering their value, market value. They've showed there was no detriment to the homeowners. Now, the Attorney General's letter in 2021, he states, "It is evident from the homeowner submission that the homeowners will be seeking to rebuild because of what they regard as the adverse impact on saleability of their houses in the future and of potential banking and insurance issues resulting from anything other than rebuilding. There's no market recovery." There still isn't to this date, 2025. 5 years that the scheme has been going on. If you don't rebuild your home, there's no market recovery. And the reason being is you're leaving defective materials behind. Who's going to buy a house? Hey, by the way, we only did the outer, but my house is cracking on the inside. Desktop study. The new housing agency consulting engineers say, it's fine. We're just going to go with option 5 because guess what? We're saving the government money. We're not saving their market value, but we're pro-government on this one. We're saving the government money. Over here, They didn't care that it went from 45,000 to 95,000 in a matter of a short period of time. And no one seen that. No homeowner had to see that. No homeowner had to stress over that. But every time since 2020, when they started the remediation, the grant scheme, we had COVID, inflation, the prices have risen. SI did an evaluation for the minister in 2022. And in 2023, they said, oh, we're going to raise the grant to $462,000. And any homeowners that were early movers and worked on their homes and rebuilt their homes, they will be able to avail the increase in the cap because of inflation. Have they got that money yet? No, not a one. And it was promised to them in 2024. What caused the two aggregate remediation schemes to have such stark differences, both in treatment to the victims and in addressing the crisis? The obvious answer is the cost to make the victims whole. With the average cost at the onset of the Pyrite heave being €45 when the Pyrite panel first investigated the issues. However, the cost has risen to €95 due to inflation COVID. The average cost for a rebuild of the home due to defective concrete blocks far exceeds the €95,000, but should not be the basis for unequal treatment. Not now, not ever. What has transpired since 2013 when the Pyrite Resolution Board was setting up the Pyrite remediation scheme and the government became aware of the defective concrete blocks is extremely unsettling for the victims and the experts researching Ireland, both in the past and present. 1 month ago, I made my second trip to Ireland since 2022, and homes are nowhere closer to being rebuilt as they technically should. It has taken me a month to sit down and write this episode because my heart aches for the affected homeowners. My head aches from the deceit and words used against the victims. My eyes swollen from tears I shed for weeks since I've come back because with all my efforts, I haven't been able to penetrate the veil that has been cast by those stakeholders in power and those advising the powers that be. The template for the Pyrite remediation scheme was well thought out and has the flexibility to address the crisis at hand. While no remediation scheme is perfect, as I was reminded by an affected homeowner here in Connecticut, USA, a week ago, that had a repair issue with the contractor, and I was also reminded when I went to Ireland and spoke at a forum by an affected homeowner that looked into the Pyrite remediation scheme. The template should have been used with modifications to deal with the costs and complexities of a rebuild. The costs and complexities change the dynamics of how the victims were dealt with and perplexes those living in a never-ending nightmare. Even wars have a reprieve. Even natural disasters have a reprieve. But there's no reprieve for the victims of defective concrete blocks. They live each day in war-torn houses with little hope of ever seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. Next month, I will share with the audience the attitudes of those reviewers and those experts advising the housing minister. Those who continue to perpetuate a false cause, those who downgrade homes from rebuild to lesser options, not for value of money, but for value of cost to the government. Those who pledge to do no harm, who insult the intelligence of the experts who have come forward to educate folks, and those who carry words with little empathy or understanding. Because of that mica myth, you have homes that cannot be sold, that only have mica with no damages whatsoever. Because of that mica myth, we have homes that are deteriorating at a rate faster than you can keep up with now because they have pyrrhotite, and yet pyrrhotite is not included in the Irish Standard 465, which drives the DCB grant scheme. So, folks, just remember this. This is an inequality. This is discrimination based on cost to make them whole. Both are aggregate schemes. Both are caused by improper sourcing. I thank you for joining me today, and I hope you tune in next time when I speak about those experts, and I will be using their words, not mine, not my opinion, their words, their actions, and their attitudes. Thank you. Bye-bye.